Royal Guard RAMS SUV through palace gates after seeing Charlotte's emergency signal from inside. The evening at the royal palace was calm, as it usually was, with the sun setting behind the tall towers. The golden light of dusk spread across the vast grounds, casting long shadows on the perfectly manicured lawns. The palace gates stood tall and imposing, guarded by the royal guard, a group of elite soldiers responsible for the safety of the royal family. Each guard was trained to be alert at all times, their discipline evident in the way they stood with perfect posture and sharp eyes. Among them was one who stood out, a young but experienced royal guard who had earned the trust of his commanders. His name was James. James had served at the palace for several years. His training had been rigorous, and he had proven himself time and time again. He wasn't the type to seek attention. His strength lay in his quiet determination. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he would take his post by the front gates, scanning the surroundings for any signs of trouble. Most nights were uneventful. The guards took their positions, patrolled the grounds, and ensured that everything was in order. But James never let his guard down, even when everything seemed peaceful. Tonight was no different. The air was cool, and the soft rustling of leaves could be heard as the evening breeze blew through the trees. In the distance, the faint hum of the city's life could be heard, but inside the palace walls, it was all calm. The royal family had retired for the night, and the only sounds were the occasional footsteps of guards and the distant barking of a dog from the nearby village. James, however, was restless. He had been with the royal guard long enough to know that peace could be fragile. A part of him always remained on edge, constantly alert, ready to respond to any threat that might arise. As he paced along his post near the gates, his eyes darted over the grand architecture of the palace. The marble walls gleamed softly in the fading light, and the golden statues of lions at the entrance seemed to watch over the palace like silent sentinels. Inside the palace, all was quiet. The royal family's private chambers were secured, with thick, impenetrable doors and windows that allowed no one to enter without permission. The staff had all gone home, leaving only the royal guards and a few high-ranking palace officers to ensure everything remained in order. James's duties were clear: maintain vigilance and be prepared for any situation. But tonight, as he walked the same path he had taken countless times before, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was a subtle sense, something that whispered in the back of his mind, but it was there nonetheless. As the evening wore on, the light from the setting sun gave way to the cool, blue hues of night. The sky darkened, and the first stars began to appear. James adjusted the collar of his uniform, the thick fabric a constant reminder of the responsibility he bore. It wasn't just any uniform. It was a symbol of protection and loyalty, one that demanded absolute commitment to the royal family. He walked past the majestic fountains that adorned the gardens, their water trickling softly in the silence. The palace grounds were vast, stretching far beyond what anyone could see from just the front gates. From his post, James could make out the flickering lights of the palace's upper floors, where the royal family resided. But despite the grandeur of it all, the palace seemed empty tonight. Even the staff's quarters appeared deserted. James had known the royal family for years, though he kept his distance. They were gracious, kind, and treated him with respect, but he was a guard, an observer, not a participant in the royal life. His role was to ensure their safety, not to become part of their world. Still, he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live within those walls, to experience the luxury and comfort the royal family enjoyed. But such thoughts were fleeting. They had no place in a soldier's mind. He was about to make another round when a flicker of movement caught his eye. It was brief but noticeable, like a shadow crossing the window of the royal wing. James froze, his senses heightened. It was strange, almost as if someone had passed by a window far above just for a moment. His heart rate quickened as his mind went into overdrive. The motion had been subtle, but it was enough to stir his instincts. At first, James thought it might have been nothing, just a trick of the light or the wind playing tricks on his eyes. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The signal he had seen wasn't enough to confirm a threat, but it was a warning, an alert that something unusual was happening inside the palace. He had seen this before during his training. There was a specific code that the royal family had put in place for emergencies, a way for them to signal the guards when danger was near. It was subtle, But the guards had been trained to notice it, and it was this very code that James had just witnessed. The window he had seen flicker belonged to Charlotte, the young princess. She was often seen in the palace, but she was known for being careful and private. James had only met her a few times, and she had always been kind, though somewhat distant. She was not the type to draw attention to herself, preferring to stay out of the public eye. But her presence in the palace was undeniable. As the daughter of the royal family, she was one of the most protected people in the kingdom. And yet here was her signal, flashing momentarily from a high window. Something was wrong. James's heart began to race as the reality of the situation set in. The subtle signal he had seen was no coincidence. It could only mean one thing: Charlotte was in danger. His mind worked quickly. The security systems at the palace were top-notch, but something had clearly gone wrong. The guards had been trained to respond to emergencies, but without direct communication, there was only one way to get to her, and that was to take matters into his own hands. James knew he couldn't wait for the usual channels of communication. He didn't have time to go through the proper procedures. If Charlotte was truly in danger, every second mattered. He made up his mind in an instant. He couldn't wait for permission, he couldn't wait for backup. He had to act now. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward his vehicle, which was parked just outside the gates. His heart raced and adrenaline flooded his veins. This wasn't a routine shift anymore. This was real, and Charlotte needed him. He could only hope that he was fast enough to make a difference. The gates loomed ahead as James reached his SUV. It was now or never. His mind was focused on one thing: getting to Charlotte. He didn't know what he was going to find when he got inside, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. The fate of the royal family was in his hands now, and he wasn't going to fail them. With a deep breath, James started the engine. The palace gates stood in front of him, but he had no intention of stopping. He had just made a decision that would change everything. James's heart was pounding in his chest as he drove the SUV towards the palace gates. Every second felt like an eternity. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but his mind was racing, running through every possible scenario. What could have happened to Charlotte? What danger could she possibly be in? Was it a threat from within the palace, or was someone trying to break in? He didn't have the answers, but he couldn't afford to waste time thinking about them. All that mattered was getting to her as quickly as possible. The dark road stretched out before him, lined with tall, imposing trees that seemed to close in on him as he drove. The silence of the night was broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of the leaves in the breeze. There were no other cars on the road, no sounds of life. The world outside felt distant, almost as if time itself had slowed down, giving him only one task: to reach the palace gates and find Charlotte. As he neared the gates, his thoughts sharpened. The royal guard was always prepared for every situation, or at least they thought they were. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to do. Breaking protocol wasn't something James took lightly. It went against everything he had been trained for. But tonight it felt like there was no other choice. The palace gates loomed in front of him, tall and sturdy, a symbol of the fortress-like security that protected the royal family. They had been designed to keep out threats, to keep the palace safe from any danger that might arise. But now, as James approached, those gates seemed like an obstacle, a barrier standing between him and the person he needed to protect. The moment he saw the flicker of Charlotte's emergency signal, it was as if a switch had been flipped in his mind. He couldn't stop. Not now, not when her life could be at risk. He slammed his foot down on the accelerator, the SUV lurching forward. The roar of the engine echoed in the quiet night, and for a brief moment, James felt like he was in a race against time itself. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he aimed the vehicle directly at the gates. He didn't hesitate. There was no room for doubt, no time to second-guess his decision. If he didn't act now, it might be too late. The gates were sturdy, reinforced with steel and designed to withstand any attempt at forced entry. But they hadn't accounted for someone in a hurry, someone determined to break through no matter the cost. As James's SUV collided with the gates, the impact was deafening. The sound of metal bending and shattering filled the air, and for a moment, it felt like the world around him had exploded in a blur of noise and motion. The SUV bounced back slightly, but James didn't let up. He pressed the accelerator harder, sending the vehicle charging forward again. With a final, powerful push, the gates cracked open and the SUV shot through the gap, now inside the palace grounds. The crash had been violent, but it had worked. The gates were no longer an obstacle, and James was closer than ever to reaching Charlotte. He didn't stop to assess the damage to the gates or the vehicle. The only thing on his mind was getting to Charlotte. The palace grounds were vast, with winding paths and towering buildings, but James knew the layout like the back of his hand. He had walked these grounds countless times during his patrols. But this time it was different. This time the stakes were higher than ever. The headlights of the SUV sliced through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead as James sped through the palace grounds. His mind was focused, but his heart was racing. What would he find when he got to Charlotte? Was she alone, or had someone else already made their move? His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he navigated the winding paths, the tall walls of the palace looming on either side. The palace was vast, but James knew exactly where to go. He had memorized every inch of it during his years as a royal guard. He knew the layout of the building, the secret corridors, and the best routes to take in case of an emergency. But this was no drill. This wasn't a practice run. This was real. Charlotte needed him, and he wasn't going to let her down. The SUV bounced slightly as it hit a small patch of gravel, but James didn't slow down. He was almost there. The royal wing, where Charlotte's rooms were located, was just ahead. He could see the lights of the palace flickering in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the grounds. But there was no time to admire the view. He had to act fast. As he neared the entrance to the royal wing, he noticed something strange. There was no movement around him. No guards rushing to intercept him, no palace officers attempting to stop him. It was as if the entire area had fallen into a strange kind of stillness. It wasn't right. Where was everyone? Where were the guards who should have been watching the entrances? James's instincts screamed at him to be cautious, but there was no time for caution. He had already broken protocol by ramming the gates, and now he had to get to Charlotte as quickly as possible. He parked the SUV near the entrance to the royal wing and jumped out, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. His hand went to the holster on his side, ready for anything. The palace grounds were quiet, too quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of the palace's air conditioning system and the faint rustling of the trees in the garden. But James didn't have time to wonder why it was so still. His focus was entirely on getting inside and finding Charlotte. He approached the entrance, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The doors were locked, but he didn't hesitate. He pulled out his keys and unlocked them, the heavy wood creaking as the door swung open. The palace interior was as grand as ever, ornate decorations, shining marble floors, and towering chandeliers. But there was no time to admire the beauty of the place. Charlotte was somewhere inside, and he had to find her before it was too late. James moved quickly through the halls, his boots echoing against the marble floors. He passed the grand staircase, the same staircase he had seen countless times before, but this time it felt different. The palace seemed empty, as if the very walls were holding their breath. It was unnatural. As he made his way down the corridor, he could hear something faint in the distance, a sound that didn't belong. It was a muffled voice, too far away to make out clearly, but it was unmistakable. Charlotte's voice. She was calling out. Panic surged through James as he picked up the pace, his footsteps quickening. He followed the sound of her voice, and soon he found himself at the door to her room. The door was ajar, and through the crack he could see a figure standing inside. Charlotte. She was standing near the window, her back to him, but something was wrong. She was looking out the window, her hands pressed against the glass, her face pale. Without a second thought, James burst through the door, his heart racing. He had no idea what he was walking into, but one thing was clear. Charlotte was in danger. He couldn't waste another moment. The door to Charlotte's room swung open with a force that echoed through the hall. James's heart was pounding as he stepped inside. The sight that met him sent a chill through his spine. Charlotte stood by the window, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. Her hands were pressed against the glass, as though she was trying to keep something or someone out. The room was eerily quiet, but the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. James took a step toward her, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The lavish decor of the royal suite, with its rich curtains and golden furniture, seemed out of place in this moment of panic. It was a far cry from the serene, controlled environment he had known for years. The silence was unnerving. "Charlotte," James called out, his voice firm but gentle. He didn't know if she had heard him or was simply lost in her own fear, but he could see her trembling from where he stood. Her eyes didn't immediately meet his, but there was a brief flicker of recognition in her expression as she turned her head slowly. She looked over her shoulder, her gaze darting nervously toward the door. The moment her eyes met his, her fear deepened. It was clear she hadn't expected anyone to come for her so soon. She was in distress, and whatever danger she had been facing was far from over. "James," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible, as if the words themselves were difficult to speak. She straightened up from the window, but her movements were slow, almost reluctant, as though she didn't want to face the truth of what was happening. I thought I was too late." James frowned, stepping forward quickly and lowering his voice. "What's going on?" "Who did this to you?" He scanned the room again, now more aware of the faint sense of unease that seemed to hang over everything. Charlotte was still too close to the window, as if something outside had her trapped in a moment of indecision. But James couldn't wait any longer to find answers. Charlotte glanced back at the window, her breath quickening. "They were here," she said, her words strained. "They tried to get in through the balcony." Her hands moved to her neck, almost as if she was trying to steady herself. "I thought I could stop them, but it's too late. They're already inside the palace." James felt his blood run cold. The danger wasn't just outside the palace gates anymore. It had infiltrated the very walls of the royal residence. Whoever had been behind this was inside, and time was running out. Charlotte's voice trembled as she spoke, but the urgency was unmistakable. He took another step toward her, his mind racing. "Where are they now? How many are there?" "I don't know," she replied, her voice shaky. "They're all over the palace. They know the layout, they know the guards' routines." Her eyes met his, and there was a look of deep fear in them. "They've been planning this for a long time." James clenched his fists. This wasn't a random attack. This wasn't some minor breach of security. Someone had carefully planned this. Someone had infiltrated the palace with the intention of taking Charlotte. But why? And how had they gotten so close to her without anyone noticing? "We need to get out of here," James said urgently. He stepped toward Charlotte, trying to guide her away from the window. "We need to move now." Charlotte didn't argue. She was still in shock, but she nodded, following him as he led her toward the door. But just as they reached it, a loud crash echoed through the palace, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps pounding down the hallway. The danger was closer than ever. They weren't alone anymore. "Get down," James hissed, pushing Charlotte behind the nearby chaise lounge. He crouched beside her, every muscle in his body tense, his mind alert. The footsteps grew louder, closer. There was no time left. Charlotte's breath was shallow, her eyes wide with panic as she clutched James's arm. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Her voice was barely audible over the sound of approaching footsteps. James's mind raced. He knew the layout of the palace better than anyone, but there was no time to strategize. They had to move quickly or they would be trapped. He could hear the footsteps nearing the room, and with each step his heart beat faster. The palace was a maze, and they were about to become part of it. Without hesitation, he grabbed Charlotte's hand and led her toward the back door. The secret passageway was hidden behind a tapestry, a relic from years of royal history. It was the perfect escape route for situations just like this. But as they reached the tapestry, a loud bang from the front door startled them both. Someone was already inside. James shoved the tapestry aside, revealing the narrow stone hallway behind it. He pulled Charlotte through, both of them ducking low to avoid making any noise. The passageway was dark, lit only by small torches mounted on the walls. But it didn't matter. James knew where it led. He had used this passage many times before, but never under these circumstances. They moved quickly through the passage, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick stone walls. James's mind raced, but he kept his focus on the task at hand: get Charlotte to safety. That was all that mattered. As they neared the end of the passage, James paused, listening for any sounds of movement ahead. They were nearing the kitchen wing, which had an exit that led directly to the palace gardens. It was their best shot at getting outside unnoticed. But as they turned the corner, they were met with an unexpected sight. A figure stood in the hallway, blocking their path. It was a guard, but not one James recognized. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face covered by a mask. His presence was a clear sign that the palace had been compromised, that someone had infiltrated the royal guard. James's heart skipped a beat. The intruders had control over the palace's security. They were inside, and there was no way to trust anyone anymore. "Stay back," the masked guard commanded, his voice cold and steady. James's hand instinctively went to the sidearm strapped to his belt. His fingers brushed against the cool metal of the weapon, but he didn't draw it just yet. He needed to assess the situation. One wrong move could cost them both. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice low but firm. "What do you want?" The guard didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his hand moving toward the concealed weapon at his side. It was clear he wasn't here to negotiate. Before the guard could react, James lunged forward, tackling him to the ground. The mask slipped off in the scuffle, revealing a young man's face. He didn't look like a typical intruder. He seemed almost out of place, his eyes wide with fear. "Get him off me," the guard shouted, struggling beneath James's grip. But James didn't let go. He had to know who was behind this. He had to get the answers they so desperately needed. James held the masked guard to the ground, his grip tight, as he tried to process the unexpected situation. The man beneath him struggled, but James was stronger, and he kept his hold steady. The dim light from the torches along the stone walls cast long shadows, making the struggle feel more intense than it probably was. Despite the physicality of the fight, there was one pressing question that filled James's mind. Who was this man? He wasn't a typical intruder. There was fear in the guard's eyes, and he wasn't behaving like someone trained to infiltrate the palace. Instead of an attacker with confidence, this was someone who seemed to be caught in the middle of something much larger than himself. "Who are you?" James demanded once again, his voice low but authoritative. He needed answers quickly, especially if they were to get Charlotte to safety. Time was slipping away, and the longer they were in the palace, the more danger they faced. The guard continued to struggle, but it was clear that James wasn't going to let him go. The tension was palpable as James's eyes locked onto the guard. There was an undeniable fear in the man's eyes, and it made James hesitate for just a moment. Perhaps this man was just another pawn in whatever scheme had taken over the palace. Perhaps he wasn't a threat at all. "Let me go," the man gasped, his voice shaky. "I don't know what's going on either. I was just following orders." James's mind raced as he processed the words. Orders? Who had given him orders? Was this part of a larger conspiracy to overthrow the royal family, or had someone inside the palace gone rogue? The possibilities were endless, but he needed to know who was pulling the strings. Whoever was behind this attack had done their homework, and their reach was wide. They had infiltrated the royal palace and corrupted the very guard who was supposed to protect it. Charlotte, who had been standing off to the side watching the confrontation, now stepped forward cautiously. She looked at James, her face still pale with fear, but now there was a flicker of determination in her eyes. "James, we need to leave," she said, her voice soft but insistent. "There's no time for this. If they're inside the palace, we need to get out before they lock everything down." James didn't want to agree, but she was right. The longer they stayed in the palace, the more dangerous it became. The guard beneath him wasn't the key to this situation. He was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle. James quickly made a decision. He released the guard's arms, and the man scrambled to his feet, his breath coming in short gasps. James took a step back, keeping his eyes on the guard but not making any moves toward him. "Listen carefully," James said, his voice firm. "You'll go to the nearest exit and you'll get out of here. If you're not with the ones who did this, then get out of the palace and disappear. If I find you again and you're part of this plot, I won't hesitate to take action." The guard hesitated, but then, to James's surprise, he nodded, his eyes wide with fear. Without saying another word, the man turned and sprinted down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. James watched him go, unsure of whether the guard would be a threat again or if he would simply flee the palace. Either way, it was one less obstacle standing between him and Charlotte's safety. Charlotte looked up at James, her face still drawn with worry. "We can't keep running. There's nowhere to hide in this palace anymore. They've already infiltrated it. We need to take control back." James nodded, his mind working quickly. She was right. The palace was compromised, but they couldn't just run forever. The danger was closing in from all sides. He had to think of a way to turn the tables. "Follow me," he said, motioning toward the end of the hallway. "There's a room in the West Wing. It's heavily reinforced, and no one knows about it except for the royal family and a few guards. It's our best chance to stay hidden until we can figure out what's going on." Charlotte nodded. and together they began to move through the dark passageways of the palace. The sounds of their footsteps echoed through the empty halls, and the tension in the air seemed to grow thicker with each step they took. James's senses were on high alert. Every corner, every door, every shadow could hide an enemy, and he couldn't afford to make a single mistake. As they approached the West Wing, James's mind replayed the events that had led them here. The signal from Charlotte's window, the ramming of the gates, the sudden infiltration of the palace, nothing made sense. But one thing was clear. Someone wanted Charlotte, and they would stop at nothing to get her. The fact that the palace security had been compromised meant that no one could be trusted. Whoever was behind this attack had planned it meticulously, using every resource they could find to ensure the royal family was vulnerable. "We're almost there," James said, his voice calm despite the chaos in his mind. Charlotte stayed close to him, her footsteps quiet, but her presence was a constant reminder of the responsibility he carried. He couldn't let anything happen to her, not now, not ever. As they reached the door to the hidden room, James paused and checked the hallway once more. The last thing he wanted was to be caught off guard now, but the hallway was empty. There was no sign of anyone approaching. With a quick motion, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room beyond was small but secure, a place where the royal family could go in times of danger. It was furnished simply, but it was safe. Charlotte stepped inside first, looking around the room with a mixture of relief and fear. She glanced back at James, her eyes softening. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." James gave her a small nod, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. "We're not safe yet," he said, his voice steady. "This is just the first step. We need to figure out who's behind all of this and stop them before they make their next move." Charlotte nodded, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "We will," she said firmly. "I know we will." James turned his attention back to the door, making sure it was securely locked. They still had a long way to go, and the palace was still under threat. But for now, they were safe. And that was enough. Inside the hidden room, the heavy silence was a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted outside. James locked the door behind them, ensuring that they were as safe as possible for the moment. The small room, though secure, was dimly lit by a single light in the corner. It wasn't much, just a place for the royal family to hide if things ever went wrong, but it was enough for now. The cold stone walls offered no comfort, only the reality of the situation. Charlotte, still shaken, sank onto the small chair in the corner, her hands resting on her lap. She looked up at James, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. There was a strong sense of gratitude in her gaze, but she knew they weren't out of danger yet. "Thank you for getting me out of there," she said quietly. "But what now? They've already breached the palace. We can't hide here forever." James's eyes remained focused on the door as he carefully took a step further into the room. His mind was already working on their next move. "We won't be hiding here long. We need to get in touch with whoever is still loyal inside the palace. Find out what's going on and how many of them are involved. We have to take back control of the palace before it's too late." Charlotte nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the window, the faint light from outside casting shadows across her face. "Do you think it's just them, the ones who tried to take me?" Her voice trembled slightly. "How could they have gotten so far inside?" James didn't have an answer for her, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was well planned. Whoever had orchestrated this attack knew the palace and its security systems intimately. They had gone to great lengths to infiltrate it, and now they had control of one of the most secure locations in the kingdom. "I don't know," James replied, his voice calm but laced with tension. "But it's not just about you. They might have targeted you, but their goal is bigger than that. They want to take down the royal family. We're dealing with something much more dangerous than we thought." Charlotte stared at him for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she processed his words. "So this is a coup?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. James nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "It's looking that way. Whoever is behind this is trying to dismantle everything the royal family has worked for, and if we don't stop them now, they'll succeed." There was a long pause as the weight of the situation settled in. Charlotte was quiet, her thoughts clearly racing. James could see the conflict in her eyes, the fear of what was happening, but also the recognition that she had a role to play in all of this. She was the one the attackers wanted, but her survival could be the key to stopping them. "Do you think anyone else knows what's going on?" Charlotte finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. James shook his head, his expression grim. I don't know. But we need to assume that no one can be trusted right now. If there are traitors inside, we have to be careful who we rely on. He looked at Charlotte, a flicker of determination in his eyes. But I'll protect you. You're not going to face this alone. Charlotte met his gaze, a quiet sense of gratitude washing over her. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. She knew she was in good hands with James, and for the first time since everything had gone wrong, she felt a small sense of relief. But the relief was fleeting. The reality of the situation still loomed over them, and there was no time to rest. I'm not going to sit here and wait for them to come to us, Charlotte said, standing up suddenly. Her voice had changed, becoming more assertive, more determined. We need to take action. If they've already gotten this far, we can't afford to be passive anymore. James's eyes widened slightly at her sudden shift in attitude. She was no longer the frightened princess he had found moments ago. Instead, she was focused and ready to take control of her fate. I'm with you, James said firmly, his voice resolute. He knew she wasn't backing down, and neither would he. But we need to have a plan. We need to gather intel, find out exactly who we're up against. Charlotte nodded. Then we'll start with the guards who are still loyal to us. We can't trust anyone who's already compromised, but there must be some who are still fighting for the palace. James's mind was already turning. He knew the palace's structure, its hidden pathways and secret rooms. They had to use every advantage they had. I'll send a signal. We've got communication systems here, but we'll have to keep it quiet. No one can know that we're still alive and active. Charlotte watched him as he moved toward the small desk at the back of the room, where a set of communication devices sat. How can we be sure they'll answer? She asked, her voice filled with doubt. James paused, glancing back at her. Because they won't have any choice. They'll have to choose sides, and if they're still loyal to the royal family, they'll answer our call. Charlotte didn't say anything else, but she watched him as he worked. She could see the quiet determination in his every move. He was focused and calm, but inside, she knew he was just as worried as she was. They both knew that the odds were stacked against them, but they couldn't afford to waste time. James tapped a few buttons on the device, sending out a discreet signal. He kept his fingers crossed as he waited. The seconds felt like minutes. If anyone was still loyal to the royal family, now was the time for them to respond. Finally, a faint beep sounded from the device. James looked at the screen and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. There was a message. Someone had replied. Thank God, he muttered under his breath. Charlotte looked over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the screen. It's them, she said, a small sense of relief washing over her. They're still alive. James quickly typed out a response, confirming their location and asking for support. He was careful with every word, knowing that any mistake could lead to betrayal. The response came almost immediately. They'll be here within the hour, James said, his voice steady. We have to hold out until then. Charlotte nodded, her expression resolute. Then we fight. We can't let them take the palace. We can't let them take everything we've worked for. James's gaze met hers, and for a moment they shared a quiet understanding. They were in this together now. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. As they prepared for what was to come, James couldn't help but think back to the moment when he had rammed the gates, when everything had seemed to fall apart. But now, with Charlotte by his side, they had a chance. They would face this threat head-on. And no matter what, they would not back down. The palace had been compromised, but they would take it back, together.